evening and welcome to Economics Unbound. Tonight we talk about the role of the State Capture Commission of Inquiry. And this commission was actually set up to seek to influence the formation of new laws to prevent the recurrence of the form of corruption that has been termed state capture. And in order to protect society and the public institutions that we have from malfeasance that leads to the benefits of public efforts and institutions of the public going unlawfully into private hands. Now, the Zondo Commission is also meant to help us strengthen institutions by taking out the toxic elements and practices that seek to weaken institutional capacity to deliver to the public in the interests of this economy and society.
Vested private interests, tearing down the edifice of public institutions, weakening them through the systematic violations of policies and laws, seeking deviations to procure improperly and irregularly in order to privilege friends and family illegitimately and unlawfully, creating a web of invisible beneficiaries so as to confuse the trail of money. These are all acts to capture the state and render it unable to function optimally. In this way, state capture differs from most other forms of corruption, which instead seek selective enforcement of already existing laws. In South Africa, the Judicial Commission of Inquiry into allegations of state capture, also known as the Zondo Commission of Inquiry, is a public inquiry launched by the government of Cyril Ramaphosa in August 2018 to investigate allegations of state capture, corruption, fraud, and other allegations into the public sector, including organizations of the state in South Africa. But even as Zondo plows through years and years of evidence, a new form of sophisticated regulatory capture continues unabated. Thandeka, can this be said to be state capture 2.0?
Well, I don't know, Nana, but the theory of regulatory capture is an economic theory that says that regulatory agencies may come to dominate or be dominated by the industries or the particular industries that they are charged with regulating. Now, the result is that an agency charged with acting in the public interest instead acts in ways that benefits the industry it is supposed to be regulating. So, Nana, the experts say that when regulatory capture is afoot, industries devote large budgets to influencing regulators, while individual citizens spend only limited resources to advocate for their own rights and interests.
Yes, indeed. Thandeka and dear viewer, regulatory capture, also known as the economic theory of regulation, or simply capture theory, became known in the 1970s due to the late George Stigler, a Nobel laureate economist at the University of Chicago, who first defined the term. Stigler noted that regulated industries maintain a keen and immediate interest in influencing regulators, whereas ordinary citizens are less motivated. As a result, even though the rules in question, such as pollution standards, often affect citizens in the aggregate, individuals are unlikely to lobby regulators to the degree that regulated industries do. Moreover, regulated industries devote large budgets to influencing regulators at federal, state, and local levels.
So I repeat, by contrast, individual citizens spend only limited resources to advocate for their own rights. So private companies get a preferred regulatory dispensation that prejudices the public by leaning on the regulator or having inordinate and disproportionate access to the regulator that ordinary citizens who are supposed to be the beneficiaries of public regulation and indeed pay for the existence of the regulator suffer a lack of access and influence.
One has to pose the journalistic question about whether this can justifiably be asked of the Reserve Bank of South Africa and the banks. ICASA's inaction as the competition court found collusive behavior between MultiChoice and the SABC, such that on Friday the 9th of November 2018, the Competition Commission filed a report with the Competition Tribunal in which it found that the SABC and MultiChoice implemented a merger transaction without notifying the Commission in contravention of the Competition Act. This is pursuant to a judgment and order delivered by the Constitutional Court in the case of SOS, Support Public Broadcasting Coalition and others, versus the South African Broadcasting Corporation Limited and others, all while the regulator looked on failing to act.
Essentially, the Commission aims to uncover the extent to which tools and organs of government that have been excessively and inappropriately used to enrich and benefit private citizens and individuals by virtue of them enjoying closeness to political power. The term state capture conveys a culture of dodgy dealings and that connections that have paralyzed some of the state's functions only for the benefit of individuals or companies that would most likely have not succeeded. The interest of the viewer in the process is to see years' worth of unlawful trade at the expense of public resources exposed and justice served for those who were directly and indirectly affected by state capture. It remains to be seen that whether the success of the project will take a form that resonates with the viewer. So according to Corruption Watch, there are details of uncertainty of many professionals working in SOEs in the industry that should be regulating them, that of auditors and accountants. Red flags have unfortunately emerged to expose several establishments, auditing firms, which have impressive global reach in links to dodgy dealings as middlemen between the state and the private sector. Whistleblowers need more support. Such an environment, rather, does little to encourage whistleblowing of magnitude imagined by Deputy Chief Justice Raymond Zondo, who is correct to assume that in order for the alleged takeover of government departments to have happened at the scale reported thus far, many public servants have to have known that enough to bring forward details that can help the Commission.
It's getting hot in here, and it's not just because it's summer, but because tonight we ask the question, is there not a move that could be dubbed State Capture 2.0?
Now let's remind everyone that in setting up the Zondo Commission, the President was implementing the recommendations by the Public Protector, Advocate Thuli Madonsela. Madonsela launched an investigation into state capture after receiving a formal complaint from Stanislaus Muyembe, a Catholic priest. In her report following the investigation, she recommended that the President assemble a commission of inquiry into state capture. The Zondo Commission is headed, as we all know, by Deputy Chief Justice Raymond Zondo. Now, most testimonies that were given before him have focused on allegations of corruption during the administration of former President Jacob Zuma. But we have to ask the question, did state capture stop with the exit of that administration? Now, due to the volume of testimonies to be heard, as well as restrictions of the imposed by the COVID-19 pandemic conditions in South Africa, the Zondo Commission's final report deadline was extended to March 2021.
Thandeka, are you aware that state capture and corruption in Russia and the old Soviet bloc preceded the privatization of state assets to a bunch of oligarchs who were preferred by the Soviet authorities, and soon much of the commanding heights of the Soviet economy were held by a coterie of politically connected oligarchs? Can this happen to us as the President speaks of the partial privatization of state assets? Could this be what sets the scene for State Capture 2.0? And if so, how can it be avoided? Thandeka, please ask your guest this question for me, please. But in the meantime, let us listen to what the President said as he announced our economic recovery plan.
We are therefore presenting before this joint sitting of Parliament and the country a reconstruction and recovery plan to drive growth that is inclusive, but growth that is also transformative. The South African Economic Reconstruction and Recovery Plan builds on the common ground established by the social partners, being government, labor, business, and community organizations. And this has been done through intensive and detailed consultations over the last few months. It is informed by the work of Cabinet's Economic Cluster, working with government departments and Cabinet itself, and draws on the contributions of the leading economists who make up the Presidential Economic Advisory Group.
Welcome back. Now on Skype we have Professor Mark Swilling. He is Distinguished Professor of Sustainable Development at the School of Public Leadership at the University of Stellenbosch. Good evening, Mark. Thank you for joining us.
Good evening.
What do you think of people in private talks, in dinner tables, in family homes, in many kinds of households, both rich and poor, throughout the country, beginning to twirl over the issue of whether state capture really ended with the exit of the Zuma administration, or whether it just morphed into something more sophisticated and something more sinister that is proceeding unabated today?
I think we have to be clear. There is specific characteristics of what we call state capture. And this was not just corruption. State capture was a systemic process which was coordinated by a political elite, a power elite centered around Jacob Zuma. And there was a political strategy to get control of public sector institutions in order to repurpose them. So, and that was partly about looting, and it was also partly about accumulating and maintaining control of power.
Now, I understand that the dual nature of state capture, but most international definitions speak of a broader concept, which is the privatization of the benefits of public institutions, and that the hollowing out that results from that are merely symptoms, characteristics of the result of state capture, rather than descriptions of state capture itself. What would you say?
That's correct. So after the transition to the Ramaphosa administration, we may not have state capture in an organized political form around the president, but we still have the legacy. So we have hollowed out institutions, we have regulatory capture in the sense that there's still networks of people who control various tender procedures and so on. And so we are suffering the consequences of state capture today. And it would be very naive to assume that a lot of the networks that were constructed during the Zuma era have just disappeared. That's simply not true. So in order to begin the dismantling, the National Prosecuting Authority has to start taking action, which has started to happen. And within the ANC, the president has tried to make sure that policies are adopted whereby people have to step aside if they are charged and those kinds of things. So we have to increase the penalties for those who have acted in a corrupt manner. And we're starting to see that, but it's probably not enough too late.
Now, isn't it better to conceive of state capture as some kind of octopus, Professor Swilling, that has many legs? One of the legs could be policy capture, where private interests seek a policy dispensation which will lead to them accumulating to a better accumulation strategy for their companies or their industry. Or regulatory capture, where you see a regulator that's meant to act in the interests of the public actually preferring and contributing to the accumulation strategy of a company or an industry or a set of companies, as well as the capture of certain tender processes in provinces and so on. So isn't it a creature of many legs?
Yeah, it's most definitely, and we see all of that. For example, the policy capture by vested interests in the energy industry, coal, trucking companies, coal miners, and so on and so forth. There's too much influence that they have within our energy policy, which is making it difficult to make the transition to cheaper, more reliable, renewable energy. So that is one particular example. But I think the core challenge, and you cited the example of Russia, is that if you start privatizing in a corrupt environment, that often goes wrong, because within that corrupt environment, there are a whole bunch of sinister interests that know how to play the game and end up getting control, now private control of what were formerly public institutions, in particular state-owned enterprises, if they are privatized in a corrupt environment.
So with
that
regard
would be
to
the worst form of capture.
With regard to privatization, Professor Swilling, what should we do to tighten up the rules of the game to prevent perverse behaviors or unconsciously creating perverse incentives?
Well, I mean, obviously we have to tighten up our rules and make sure that they are properly implemented and there's capacity in place to make sure that corrupt elements cannot continue. But that in and of itself is insufficient. You have to have more prosecutions. You have to increase the costs of being corrupt. And at the moment, those costs are not that high. And that's one of the problems that we face. But there is a downside of this increasingly intense control over the behavior of public servants, so that on the assumption that they're all trying to be corrupt, is that it limits innovation, it limits risk-taking, it limits their capacity to be creative. And that is also not what we want, because that prevents the developmental state that we say we are committed to.
Yes, it's often said that law and policy can be blunt instruments, and it would be difficult to calibrate the exact balance that you seem to be saying is desirable between innovation and sufficient tightness to prevent the gobbling up of our entire public system by more corrupt or sinister forces. How long do you think this country would take to be out of the woods? Or is state capture something that a country must continuously work at and pushing back at? I'm thinking of countries like America, where in financial services, one of the central banks, in fact, the Central Bank of New York, faced a situation with a very dominant bank leaning over it, and it's often given as a textbook case of regulatory capture. But is it something that must consciously be a work in progress and built into our institutional fabric? How can we make our institutions resilient to these forms of insidious corporate behavior?
Thandeka, there isn't a silver bullet. It's a combination of prosecutions, of effective court decisions, of citizen action, of whistleblowers, of media players like yourself, creating what I would like to call an ecosystem of accountability, where board oversight, board subcommittees, journalists, citizens collaborate in order to create this collective watchdog over the health of all of our institutions. That's how we need to think of it. But you're right, there are patterns to this. There are times of deep corruption and systemic looting, like we went through, and there are times of cleanup and transformation. And the cleanup and transformation can take a decade. And you never get rid of corruption, but you have to get to a point where corruption is not endemic and is not the norm, but rather the exception.
Yes, so we perhaps have to get used to the idea that all these arrests will not just happen tomorrow, even though most citizens desire this. But other countries have introduced forms of governance in boards that ruggedize their systems against these forms of capture. For example, the German model of social cooperation have got multi-stakeholder boards that keep each other in check. So you will have civil society representatives on a public broadcasting board. You'll have staff representatives on a pensions board. And you'll have a multiplicity of stakeholders who keep each other in check so that one dominant interest doesn't easily hold sway. What do you think we can learn from models such as those?
I think we can learn a lot. I don't think there's sufficient diversity on our boards. Our boards in state-owned enterprises, in major corporations, et cetera, tend to be dominated by a relatively narrow business elite. And many of these board members are interconnected with one another across different boards.
Yes, playing musical chairs.
Are kind of they're reluctant to contradict each other.
Well, I think that's where we'll have to end it for tonight. I certainly learned a lot from our engagement, and we hope that as we deal with this issue going forward, we'll have more of these kind of interactions on air. Thank you very much. That was Professor Mark Swilling of the University of Stellenbosch. Now, former Transnet Chief Financial Officer Anoj Singh allegedly instructed a financial manager to adjust a R1 billion cost escalation for 100 locomotives. Now, the State Capture Commission heard today that Freight Rail Executive Finance Manager Yusuf Laher was asked to manipulate calculations to ensure they corresponded with a memorandum to be presented to the board.
Laher testified the price escalation for each locomotive resulted from using the Japanese yen in final calculations. This was despite the locomotives Transnet was acquiring from China South Rail being a dollar-based fleet. Previously, electrical engineer Francis Callard criticized Laher for failing to change the foreign exchange rate to the US dollar. Callard was sidelined after he'd authored the original business case for the 100 locomotives from a Japanese manufacturer, Mitsui, and not China South Rail.
You were trying to justify the increase to 44, which had already been agreed.
I wasn't justifying anything. Mr. Singh was preparing the memo.
Yes, but you knew that's what Mr. Singh was doing.
That's what Mr. Singh was doing.
And did that not make you, did you not feel uneasy about being involved in this process? I mean, already you were concerned about the price. Were you not concerned about involvement with this memorandum?
I don't think so. I mean, where I didn't know what was happening in the memo, he would have got the inputs and he would have provided instruction to the other sections of the memo.
Laher again denied allegations he had authored a memorandum requesting an increase from the board. He blames former Transnet CFO Anoj Singh. He said to his surprise, Singh informed him that the board had approved a proposal to procure each locomotive at R3 million more than his own calculations.
Are there substantial parts of the memorandum that you authored yourself?
No.
All right. So you're given a draft and you work it up and he then amends it.
Yeah.
What we need to know, which is important, is do you take ownership then of that memorandum? Do you accept that you were ultimately the author with the input of Mr. Singh?
No.
Okay, what are you saying? That you performed simply a secretarial function?
Yes.
Then why
and,
not just...
and chase up whatever information he wanted me to chase up.
Yeah.
The Commission will continue with Transnet-related testimony when it resumes on Friday. Mbalenhle Mthethwa, SABC News, Johannesburg.
Thank you, Mbali. On Skype, we have the spokesperson of the South African Communist Party, Dr. Alex Mashilo, an economist. Hello, Alex, how are you?
Hi, how are you doing?
I'm well, thank you. Thanks for joining us this evening.
Thank you very much.
State Capture 2.0, what does that conjure up in your mind?
The phenomenon of state capture is an old phenomenon, and secondly, it is not only a national phenomenon. So when you use the word state capture 2.0, especially in the context of South Africa, one thing that comes to an ordinary mind, mine included, is that state capture did not end with the removal of former President Jacob Zuma from office as a phenomenon. And
well, that's interesting.
Hope we will look at
Alex, I was jotting in, I apologize for just jumping in, but the public narrative and the narrative in the popular press is that state capture happened between certain years, 10 wasted years of looting, and now the criminality of those years is being brought to book through the Zondo Commission, and we can, as citizens, relax and look forward. As long as these people are arrested, we can look forward to 10 years of no capture and relative prosperity. Is that a dangerous notion?
It is a very dangerous notion. It is a notion that forgets that we had something called strategic defense acquisition in South Africa. Companies from Europe, France, and elsewhere paid bribes to certain individuals. At least there was one successful prosecution in that regard in South Africa. And some of the companies that benefited from that deal, known as the arms deal in the media, had since confessed to have paid more bribes in South Africa. And these confessions were in countries such as the United States and the United Kingdom. As to why there was no follow-up prosecution of those companies in South Africa, perhaps only state capture knows. By state capture, reference is to undue influence on the state, on state officials, on public representatives, and on state authorities, including those who are in public entities. And this undue influence comes from the private sector and is geared towards private wealth accumulation. It happens in the policy space and benefits from corruption and related activities.
Now, I understand this kind of state capture normally happens to societies in transition. And it burst into the world of economic discourse, not only in the 1970s with the Chicago Boys and George Stigler, where it was narrowly referring to regulatory capture, but when the Eastern Bloc countries became, when the Soviet bloc unraveled, those societies in transition experienced massive state capture, especially that those people who swirled around presidents who were busy privatizing certain assets. So it happens to societies in transition, I learn, or I read, and societies that are going through rapid privatization. Are we not in danger? Because we are a society in rapid transition, and we are about to undergo a rapid period of the privatization of some of the SOEs.
Thank you very much. The literature survey shows that the term state capture was used by the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development in looking at the transitions that occurred in the Eastern Europe from the economies that were part of the former Soviet Union, which underwent a transition to a market economy. So the European Central Bank for Reconstruction itself, which was started in 1991, was actually promoting the corporate interest of Western European multinational corporations, which were interested in those countries. And there was competition because North American companies had also made in to those countries. So this was a 10-year review of what happened in those countries from 1989 to 1999. Fast forward to South Africa now. We achieved our transition from apartheid in 1994 to the current democratic dispensation. The first major acquisition that occurred immediately after our transition was the strategic arms procurement or strategic arms acquisition. So what happened in that strategic arms acquisition or strategic defense acquisition, which the media calls the arms deal? Didn't we see the elements of state capture or the elements of the type of capture that occurs in transitional society? So to the extent that we at least had one successful case of prosecution and confessions in other countries of the bribes that were paid in that deal, that means that we were at risk. But by the way, we are like those countries because privatization and outsourcing of state functions became entry points for corporate capture when the public sector was converted into a field of private wealth accumulation by private companies organized around tenders. You can see that the same thing happened here in South Africa right now when we look at the procurement of the personal protective equipment. It is right in the procurement space that the corruption took place, and that corruption could not have happened without undue influence. And the term undue influence actually summarizes one of the key activities through which state capture occurs. So in other words, for so long as we have a tender state, and for so long as we have a state in which society-state relations are mediated by private sector interests, we are vulnerable to capture, including capture of the policy space as a vehicle towards accumulation through capture of tenders.
Now, we as citizens, each one of us, own these public companies. So we should be concerned because these are our assets. These are public assets. We pay for them. And we are supposed to benefit public goods from these assets. And when they are captured in this way, they are taken away from the public good, which is their mandate, and very often they are hollowed out. They are rendered unable and incompetent and just physically unable to carry out even the basic things that economic policy wants these public institutions to carry out?
Definitely. There are about 3 phases you can say state capture in South Africa has assumed. Looking at the first phase of the strategic defense acquisition and the bribes that were paid there as proven by the court of law. And that era also in the policy space, there was this, growth, employment and redistribution program that brought about privatization and liberalization. So that privatization opened up the window for state capture. From from 2009 coming this side, something happened. There was emphasis on not privatizing state-owned enterprises. These state-owned enterprises were kept. However, state capture took the form of the hollowing out of these state-owned enterprises, with private interests even influencing appointments into the boards of state-owned entities, as we have heard from the Commission of Inquiry into state capture. Beyond 2017, something is happening. Certain things are being implemented in the name of fighting state capture. But if you analyze these policy reforms that are implemented in the name of cleaning up the so-called 10 wasted years, the overall direction consists in this and this only. That is the transfer of public assets to private profit interests.
Now,
and that occurs through the policy. So future generations will have to discuss, will have to analyze and examine whether there was no undue influence on this. How come do we go out and vote for the government to serve the people?
Are you attributing this to policy capture?
Yes. How come do we go out as society to vote for the government to serve the people? And once in power, those who we have voted to serve society begin to tell us private sector this, private sector that, private sector this here, we must do away with this company, give it to the private sector, we must take this state infrastructure, give it to the private sector. That is the conveyance of productive state assets to private companies for profit competition. And
now,
it results in the capture of those assets. And then that capture occurs through the policy space.
Now, Dr. Mashilo, looking at the economic recovery plan, I have two fears. We are entering a phase of liberalization of state-owned enterprises, as well as we are entering a phase where we are rationalizing many of the state-owned enterprises. Therein lies really important opportunities for malfeasance, a la Russia, a la Eastern Bloc.
The question is, whose agenda is that agenda? Is it the agenda of the South African electorate? Was that agenda put forward to the electorate to vote for, or did that agenda emerge after the electorate went to the ballot? Whose agenda is it? So at this moment, we do not know.
After many of the SOEs were rendered incompetent, unable to deliver on their mandate and hollowed out, and all the money gouged out of them, the public lost confidence in the ability of the state to run companies.
The public lost confidence in the ability of the state to run certain companies. What happened, for example, with companies like, the South African Reserve Bank, an institution established in terms of the Constitution of the Republic, came in when a private commercial bank collapsed. Saved that private commercial bank, all right? So state capture is a complex phenomenon. After the South African Reserve Bank came in to save the African bank and things are beginning to run as normal, that stake is now transferred to the capture of corporate interests who will be benefiting from the intervention made by the South African Reserve Bank. The reality of state capture is that it's not a state-only affair. It is an affair driven by private profit interests making use of the state through the exploitation and the capture of those who are capturable in the state.
So these private interests then seize hold of a public enterprise or utility or regulator and use it for their own interests as if it were their own?
Including that their interest could be to run down these public assets so that society will lose confidence in the state and assert the private sector as economic monopoly. So the the running down of these entities is not an innocent thing. It is driven from the private sector, and its end result is that of cementing private monopoly of the economy.
Well, thank you very much for explaining your perspective on how state capture unfolds in our economy and in our society. And we'll have this debate for a long time to come in our country. Thank you very much for joining us this evening, Alex Mashilo. Dr. Mashilo, thank you. We'll be back just after this short break. Welcome back. On Skype, we have Valencia Talane from Corruption Watch, and also when whistleblower Bianca Goodson wrote to Eskom requesting public acknowledgement of her contribution. She didn't expect a response, but she got one. Welcome, ladies. Thanks for joining us. Now, let's start with Corruption Watch. We're discussing whether corruption in the form of state capture, which is grand corruption, systematic corruption that's defined as the private sector sometimes, or private interests or vested private interests, using the state as a site of accumulation. And doing so illicitly, but sometimes the mechanisms used are not necessarily unlawful. Can you tell us what you are experiencing? Has state capture stopped with the exit of the last administration? And are we now dealing with the cleanup? Or are we seeing a morphing of the phenomenon into more sophisticated, more insidious forms? Talena, you go for it.
Thank you very much.
Yes. Proceed. I can hear you.
I'd say that is. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you perfectly.
Oh, okay. I would like to start off by saying that the concept of state capture in itself is one that's obviously not new. We've heard different explanations or descriptions of it over the years. So from our perspective as Corruption Watch, I would say that as far as the reports that we get from public officials, for instance, who are entrenched in what they see happening in public entities or government departments, it's that you sort of see networks, so to speak, of the same people who are trying to come in and take over running of the department, big decisions that are being made within departments or state entities. And of course, there's that element of not being able to do anything about it, because you know that the people who are involved in those networks are not necessarily going to be held. This issue that we see as Corruption Watch has been not just that corruption does.
So in other words, you see,
but that because nothing.
Sorry, let me understand you clearly. You're saying that you're seeing new networks forming, old networks morphing into new networks with the same sort of extractive agenda. And that you are hearing it as Corruption Watch from people entrenched in public enterprises and public institutions.
No, what I'm saying is that we are hearing from public officials who see things that happen in their departments or entities, and they come to us because they realize that accountability is an issue, whether within the organization itself or in other law enforcement entities. So the problem there becomes, it seems to be at the grand scale that it is, and it seems to go on for as long as it does, because everybody understands the system to be the kind that doesn't really hold those who are corrupt within the government system accountable.
So there's something systemically wrong with our governance systems, that they are unable to properly apprehend the corrupt and to protect these public institutions. There's a weakness in the system, are you saying?
Absolutely, and I think what the State Capture Commission has highlighted, at least for civil society organizations, has been the issues that we've put forward in the past, that it's not so much that we don't have the laws, the best laws to perhaps even prevent corruption from happening. It's the fact that those who know how to circumvent them are able to do so, knowing exactly that their actions are not going to come to the point
that they are
where
going to meet impunity.
Exactly, yes.
Please come, and you've been a whistleblower at one of our largest and our most important SOEs, one that in fact is at the base of the building of this economy. What was that experience like, and what's your take on what Corruption Watch has just said now, and what do you think of state capture?
Okay, so let me just agree firstly with the lady from Corruption Watch. I do think that, we do have an issue when it comes to accountability, and I fully agree that there are people that within our organizations that are circumventing existing legislation. But I think my point is a lot stronger than that. I think our legislation is not enough, not just in terms of whistleblowing, I'll get to that later, but I think our legislation, there are not enough checks and balances within our legislation to actually stop corruption from happening. So, for example, when you want to do business with the state, you are compelled to have a supply development partner in some instances. And what we've seen happen in our country so far is that brings rise to things like BEE fronting. An example of this would be in the Transnet 1064 transaction, where the local entity, CSR Iloco, was established purely to comply with BEE requirements, even although they didn't have any of the manufacturing capability to make the locomotives themselves. So we have this legislation that puts a lot of pressure on entities to say that, yes, you've got to do social development, you've got to have supply development practices in place, and you've got to be BEE compliant. And it leads
to a lot of
but we don't have enough checks and balances to actually see that the value is going to the end user.
Yeah.
We don't have enough checks and balances in our legislation at the moment to actually ensure that those that are intended to be helped with this legislation are actually, in fact, being helped with this legislation.
No,
and I don't...
Sorry, I would like to rush you along, because I think you both agree on the point that the legislation itself can yield perverse incentives, and people behave perversely because of the design of the legislation itself. But I wanted to get to the issues that you said you would get to later, about how we can tighten up whistleblower protection.
Okay. Look, I think it's human nature that you always behave in a manner in which you're incentivized. I think it goes against human nature to do things where there isn't the right incentive. In my case, for blowing the whistle, I was incentivized by my moral conscience. And that was enough. But the question is, can you really appeal to the greater majority of people in this country to do exactly the same thing? And I don't think that's reasonable. So the protections that I see that are necessary in our country to protect whistleblowers would be something like what Mandy Winder has been advocating at the moment, would be like a Chapter 9 institution or a safe house, where there is an entity that is funded by the state to provide to whistleblowers things like emotional support, financial support, and safety if required. And I would go as far as saying that I think an institution like that should actually be funded from successful civil claims of corruption.
Wow. It would be a nice way around the issue of incentivized disclosures. But we have run out of time, and that's all we really have time for tonight. We hope to have this discussion with you in the future. Thank you very much for joining us, ladies, this evening. And that's how we come to the end of Economics Unbound, and we've been discussing State Capture 2.0. Good night, Khonantine Mawet.